Unique people leading unique lives shape and inform Iowa City. This community is enhanced by these women and men who live in our midst, working, teaching, creating. Welcome to a series of conversations with people who have stories to tell. Join my special guests and me, Ellen Buchanan, in a series of interviews called One of a Kind. Eldon Obrecht, a longtime Iowa Citian, is a musician, a composer, a teacher, a community contributor, a husband and father of 4 daughters. He received his undergraduate and graduate degrees from Iowa, played double bass in the Navy Pre-Flight School Band, the National Symphony in Washington, D.C., and for many years was a principal bassist with the Tri-City Symphony, now the Quad City Symphony. In addition to his teaching double bass at the University of Iowa, Eldon gave of his time and talents to the University Symphony Orchestra, the Iowa City Community String Orchestra, and the Chamber Singers of Iowa City. The musical careers of well-known Iowa Citians like Philip Greeley-Clapp, Charlie Ebel, Chris Schrock, Laird Addis have interfaced with the career of Eldon Obrecht. In addition to teaching double bass, he taught music theory and composition. 3 symphonies composed by Eldon have been performed by the University Symphony Orchestra. In previous years, Iowa Citians would tune in to his History and Music Appreciation course broadcast on WSUI. He and his musician wife, Maxine, raised 4 daughters in Iowa City, Celia, Julie, Nancy, and Martha, and all 4 of them are musicians also. He and his wife travel extensively and adventurously. Welcome to One of a Kind.
Thank you.
I know your story begins in June of 1920, where you were born in a small town, Rolfe, Iowa. Tell me a little bit about your first family, your parents, and were they musicians?
No, well, my mother played some piano, but mostly I heard this piano playing when us boys were up in bed, and we'd hear her playing the piano downstairs. But, my father ran the moving picture theater.
Rolfe had a theater?
Oh, of course. It was called the Ritz. Actually, in those days, it was called the Scenic, before when it was just no sound in. But the Ritz Theater, I mean, the moving picture theater, the Scenic, had a pianist, Mrs. LaChance.
Mm.
And she played the piano, and she was my first formal piano teacher.
What a lovely name.
I know. I always, in my mind, I've referred to her as Madame LaChance.
Madame LaChance. And so you
Yes.
took piano lessons from her?
That's right. And then from after we got sound movies, there was no place for Mrs. LaChance anymore. So I studied with a local Rolfe lady who had graduated from Drake University, Amy Ireland.
Mm.
And then the Depression came, couldn't afford lessons anymore. And then we come to the bass, because the high school superintendent in what would be about 1933 decided Rolfe should have a high school orchestra that would compete in state contests and so forth. And the superintendent and the music teacher went down to Des Moines and bought some instruments, and there had been some violinists who had been studying with a lady in West Bend, so we had a corps of stringed instruments. But who would play these basses that they brought 2 of them back from Des Moines, and I was one of the people chosen to learn the double bass.
And you liked it immediately, or was, I mean, this is the biggest instrument in the orchestra.
Of course. And my father thought, oh, he'd like that because it makes these nice, deep sounds. My father was especially musical, but I was glad he appreciated the idea of deep sounds, you know, so did I.
So tell me, in Rolfe, what was Rolfe, Iowa growing up? About how many people would you say?
1,000.
1,000. Mm-hmm. And how did you find a teacher who could tell you how to learn and play this instrument?
Well, there were 2 men who, Carl Spotvold and Carl Spotvold Jr., I believe. They were principal and assistant principal clarinetists of Carl King's band in Fort Dodge, Iowa, something of a semi-professional band. And in these Depression days, these 2 gentlemen would go from school to school, spending a day at each school giving private lessons. And we paid for these private lessons 35 cents for a half-hour lesson individually. And one of them, Carl Spotvold Sr., had had a little experience with string bass. And so he was my first teacher.
Now, before I leave Rolfe, there was another very famous person who grew up in Rolfe, Iowa. And didn't your brother have something to worked for Mrs. Hancher?
Yeah, well, President Hancher was, his mother lived across the street from us, and my brother mowed lawns for Mrs. Hancher. President Hancher was one of two Rhodes Scholars from Rolfe. And a town of 1,000 had two Rhodes Scholars.
And who was the other?
Gordon Siefkin, who taught at the University of Tennessee economics. And it was really quite a wonderful town.
There must be something in your drinking water there, all
something
that
like
talent.
It was a very prosperous farming country, and there intermarried interesting people in farming, and a wonderful school system, in spite of its small size.
And I know you competed. I did research on you, and you competed, and you went, you won local contests, and you went state, and even went to some national. Now, did you think, okay, I'm going to college and continue to study in music, or were you interested in something else?
For a long while, I just didn't know, but then sort of fell into this music business. I auditioned for another school in the state, and I wrote Philip Greeley Clapp a letter. I didn't audition for him, but I told him about my background. And he replied with a long, warm, friendly letter, and I was attracted right away. Of course, a little scholarship money helped.
Of course. Now tell me, so Clapp wrote you this letter, and you came to Iowa, and did he become your mentor here?
I'd say he's my musical mentor.
Musical mentor.
That's right. When I first came, there was no string bass teacher, naturally. There was a graduate assistant teaching cello. They didn't have a full-time cello teacher. Only as a junior, Dr. Clapp brought in Hans Kelbel, who was, when I was a junior, he had brought in the Menzers family. Incidentally, the Menzers live where the Bedells now do.
Okay.
I think it's Karl Menzer. Yes, Karl Menzer. And they were excellent German musicians who had been in the Chicago area. The violinist, Karl Menzer, and Hans Kelbel, the cellist. And Hans Kelbel was well-schooled and important cellist nationally. Actually, he studied with Klengel, who was in cello pedagogy extremely important, was a fellow student of Feuermann, and so forth. Well, Kelbel taught bass, and I was his bass, and he was wonderfully helpful to me.
So tell me, what did Clapp, I know not perhaps people who are viewing this would remember or have been here long enough to know Philip Greeley Clapp. He did a lot for this music department. And
oh yes, he had an extremely rich background. He was from Boston area. He'd been he was a protege of the conductor of the Boston Symphony. He was the first PhD from Harvard. He got a PhD in composition. And then he came out here and he started building this music school. He developed the University Symphony so that in the late 1930s we considered it ranked, well, the only comparable University Symphony in those days was Eastman. And he incidentally was a friend of the man who'd been, Howard Hanson, who developed Eastman. And a vivid, colorful personality, an extremely important composer in his way. By the way, his first two symphonies he conducted with the Boston Symphony back right after World War I, or no, before World War I, and so forth. Well, anyway, he was a colorful, sometimes controversial personality because he had, as many times in those days, musicians often had vigorous tempers, and he had a temper.
I was reading, just thumbing through Gerber's book on the pictorial history of the university, and they said that he was quite egotistical, or some people thought he was quite
yes, he was.
kind of a bigger-than-life person, and of course then the university named Clapp Recital Hall after him, which was...
Sure. He was also a natural pianist. He could play just anything on the piano, and he could, a fantastic music reader. He could take an orchestral score, reduce it on the piano, just sight read it like that. And In those days, you know, phonograph records were not very good. He had a few favorite phonographs, but in those days when he was teaching the history and appreciation course, he taught it mostly from the piano. And he was playing Beethoven symphonies, Bruckner symphonies, Brahms symphonies, Tchaikovsky symphonies at the piano, along with, of course, standard piano repertory. And actually, I think I sat through his music appreciation course several times. It was a 2-year sequence. I think I went through it at least 3 or 4 times before I came back as an instructor, and it was one of the most important parts of my education.
I want to talk about it first before I talk about that. The war interrupted you.
Oh, yes.
Had you gotten your graduate degree by then, or was this?
I got a master's degree.
Master's degree, and then you were shipped off to the Philippines, and you were in a band there.
Well, at first, I was in the pre-flight school band here in Iowa City. And then the band broke up there, and various players went various places, and one contingent went over to the Philippines. That's right.
So after the war, where did your career take you?
Well, I wanted to decide whether I was going to get into a professional symphony or not, whether I really wanted to be a symphony player. I got interested in composition. My master's degree was in composition. So I decided, well, maybe I should study with somebody. Professor Kelbo was marvelous, but he was a cellist. Maybe I should study with a professional bassist. And so right after the war, I went off and studied with Ludwig Jute, who was a virtuoso bassist in Boston Symphony. Had a fine time. My goal was study a little while and then see if I could get a job in a professional symphony orchestra. Well, actually, during the war, I married Maxine. And we had our first youngster. But anyway, Maxine's father died, and whoops, pretty important to come and try to help things. Maxine was an only child, help pull the family together here. And on the way back, I decided, well, why don't I just audition for an orchestra? So I auditioned for an orchestra, got a job. Well, okay, my point in studying with Professor Jute and with Ludwig Jute, and it was a wonderful experience, though, was to get a job. Now I thought, well, I've got my job, and I just didn't seem financially desirable to go back and study some more in Boston. I liked playing in the National Symphony, but in the middle, I played there in a summer season, and then in the middle of the winter season, I got this letter from Dr. Clapp.
There he is in your life again.
Here he is. Would I be interested in an instructorship? And I could finish off a doctorate and at the same time have this instructorship, and it was not very good pay, but it was better than the citizenship would have been. And I looked at myself and I said, look, I would get lazy if I were playing in a symphony orchestra, and this would be much more broadening and stimulating. So I took the job.
So you came back. And so your musical career is teaching, it's been performing, and it's been composing. So was the draw, part of the draw coming back to teach?
Sure. Teaching, well, you know, they're all tangled up together. You know, I mean, the composing, the teaching, I didn't know where all this was going to lead me, but I just had a feeling I was going to grow more, even probably be a better bassist if I were in that particular.
Now, teaching, you mentioned this and I mentioned in my introduction of you, the WSUI, that broadcast. Tell me about the history of that course. It was so popular. People who were home taking care of their children would tune in to you.
Well, of course, Dr. Clapp is the one that started. You know, WSUI was a pioneering radio station with Carl Menzer. Okay. And one of the pioneering things was, and Dr. Clapp had been broadcasting this course back since the early 1920s, within the beginning of WSUI. Well, when he died, he occasionally, as a couple of summers, he'd gone off in vacation to the state of Washington. He'd leave me with a class in phonograph records. Fortunately, phonograph records had improved, so I was able to pull it off. I have modest piano skills. I could not conceive of teaching the course on the piano the way he did. And anyway, that's how I started with it. Then he died, and I simply took over the class.
And you did it for what, about 20-some years?
Oh, longer than that. I took it over in 1953 and taught till, well, 1990. Subtract it, that's more like 37, isn't it?
37 years, but it was about 20 years you mentioned.
I broadcast.
Broadcast for
broadcast till 1972. And Then we got into the music building. My time schedule, or the time schedule we set up for the class, was not one that worked very well with WSUI. And in time, I also renamed the class.
What did you rename it?
Oh, a real jazzy name.
Oh, tell me.
Masterpieces of Music.
Masterpieces
Also
of
a little
music.
bit elitist, too. It was history and appreciation of music, like the history and appreciation of art course, which in those days, in my early days, Lester Longman taught. And then there was there were changes from the core course to the general education plan, and there was some thinking that we really shouldn't mix history and appreciation of things. I think the historians felt that somehow if an element of appreciation came into history, history might be weakened a little bit.
How did you feel about that?
I didn't entirely agree. But anyway, okay, history and appreciation, let's dream up new titles. I'm not sure what the School of Art and Art History came up with. I don't remember now, but I came up with Masterpieces of Music.
Oh, I wish I could have tuned into that. Now tell me, I know composing, besides you've had students on the double bass, you've taught composition and music theory, and now you're a composer, and I read that you've had 3 symphonies performed by the University Orchestra?
First was my thesis symphony. Oh, that was quite an occasion, too.
Oh, tell me about that.
Well, my wife, Maxine, is a singer and soprano, and a very good singer. When we first met, as a matter of fact, we were both graduate assistants in the School of Music. This is right before, well, right before World War II, rather. She had a graduate assistantship in voice, and I had my little string bass assistantship. And well, then then I went into the Navy, and before we got married, she taught at Ward Belmont College in Nashville, Tennessee, and then we got married. But my symphony, that was my thesis symphony, my PhD thesis symphony. I was sort of thinking about Mahler, and I tucked in a couple movements as were songs for voice, for soprano and orchestra. And so, and then Dr. Clapp programmed this symphony of mine, their songs to texts of Shelley, and Maxine was a soloist.
Oh,
and
that must have been quite a thrill.
Occasion. That was a lovely occasion, sure.
Oh, that must have been very. And then Clapp was the conductor?
Oh, he was the conductor, sure. Down, you know, those days we had our concerts down at the Memorial Union Lounge. That's right. And that was
before Clapp Hall was
before Clapp Recital Hall and before Hansher Auditorium, you know.
So when did you start composing for the double bass, or was that during this period?
Oh, you know, the double bass was my specialty instrument, and I was a little careful not to get, I didn't want to get trapped just being somebody who just write for the bass, you know. That was too easy. So for a long time I didn't write much. Oh, I wrote one piece for a sonata, same time as writing the symphony, as a sort of little relaxation from writing on the symphony. And then I wrote mostly other things, and then somewhere around in the 1980s, I said to myself, no, 70s, in the 1970s, look, I know this instrument very well. Why don't I just settle down and write quite a lot of music for it, and write music for myself to play in recitals? And I gave quite a number of recitals, about every other year, and that's a lot of double bass recitals. That's many of them, you know, featuring these new compositions. And they all finally climaxed in a concerto for bass with piano, percussion, and chamber orchestra, and that we did with the University Symphony in 1986.
What a career you've had. And then people tell me that you've been involved in Davenport, in the Quad Cities, since the 30s. You've been driving to, I know there was a hiatus during the war and a few years, but you could probably drive to Davenport almost blindfolded.
Almost automatic, except you see there have been new routes. The interstate wasn't, you know, I knew the old way too.
What was the old way when you started?
The old was the old Highway 6, going past an area that I think they're thinking of, there's controversial shall we have a housing development out there? That
Oh,
was the old
that
Highway
was the
6.
way.
That's right.
So you had a long and satisfying association with the Quad City Symphony.
That's right. I'm still going there.
Are you still doing it? Are you
still playing it?
Still playing?
That's right. I have a replacement. As you know, I retired 1990, but then I continued to teach bass. Well, and finally, they got a wonderful replacement for me, Diana Gannett, who got her bachelor's under me in 1969, and went off then and did her graduate work at Yale, and she's my replacement, and I'm so excited about this too.
And I know you've performed or played with the chamber singers and been so generous to them, and the University Symphony. Did you really teach the first Ironman team, the football team?
Oh yes, that was when I was sort of in charge of a lot of the paperwork under Dr. Clapp in the Masterpieces course. And yes, I think in with the first Iron, we had the entire Ironman team. Dr. Clapp had a sort of liberal philosophy of grading that was the Dickens thing to administer. He didn't give tests, but he asked us to grade these people on the quality of papers that he'd assign every now and then. And they're kind of informal papers. And on attendance. Well, the word got out that this is an easy way to get a good grade. And so that's how we happened to get the entire Ironman team in the last couple of years. When I took over the class, I changed that. I decided that I didn't, they were welcome, you know, but they'd have to have tests.
Yes.
I lost them all.
You lost all the football players.
That's right.
I want to ask you a little bit about your personal life. I know you mentioned your wife, Maxine, that you met in school here, and she's a musician. And you had raised 4 daughters in Iowa City.
That's right.
And they, too, are musicians.
That's right.
That's amazing.
One way or
Is
other.
it running? Is the blood in the gene code?
It would seem to be. You know, some of them sometimes, well, one of them, for instance, who was immensely talented, decided, 2 of them, decided they weren't going to get degrees in music. But here they are, back in music one or other. Celia decided she would get a degree, she's our oldest, in English. But what's she doing now? She's teaching Suzuki cello in Tacoma. And that's one of them, playing in the Tacoma Symphony and various other things. She's very active in musical matters in Tacoma, Washington.
And your second daughter, Julie, she's also a cellist.
No, second daughter, Julie, is a violist, although she also plays violin. And she has a Suzuki school, the Central Texas String Institute in Waco, Texas, amongst other things. She's also the violin concert mistress of an orchestra in a small city south of Waco, Temple, and she's the principal violist of the Waco Symphony. She's doing so many things, I don't know how she also has 2 youngsters, how she keeps track of everything. Number 3 is one who decided she wasn't going to get, Julie has a DMA in viola performance. Nancy is on Martha's Vineyard, and she was one who got actually a degree from Evergreen College in art, but she got back to music, and she's brushed up her violin skills. She's teaching Suzuki violin on Martha's Vineyard. And then my number 4, Martha, was the bass player of the 4. She started on violin. Both she and Nancy's worked with Mrs. Prussel in the Prussel School. This was in its early days. But she decided she wanted to do bass, and she did well in bass. She's not very. She's one of the youngest grandchildren, and she's mostly devoting herself to children at this stage in her life. But she.
Do you ever play together, the 5 of you?
No.
No, you don't.
It's too hard to get. We get together for weddings and things like that, but we don't get together with instruments.
Now, I know you said you retired, but you're not retired because you're performing, you're teaching, and I know you and your wife love to travel. Tell me about that. And you're off someplace very soon, I know. That's
right. We've booked an elder hostel trip to Paris, as a matter of fact, an Art in Paris elder hostel trip, and we're going there in late April, and we'll get back in early-ish May. Actually, over the years, our travels started out heading west. And we had and we have some very good friends who had been on the engineering faculty at Iowa. And we We visit them. The Lonsdales, I don't know, some people might remember the Ed Lonsdales. We visit them, and they have a cabin in the Snowy Range, 40 miles west of Laramie. It's a beautiful, idyllic setting, and we're looking forward to visiting them, as a matter of fact, this July. We still do this. But then our oldest daughter moved farther west and was living on the West Coast up in Washington. So that gave us inspiration to make bigger circles. And then gradually, from time to time, Europe beckoned, you see. Mm-hmm. And we've traveled a fair amount with our friends, Dr. and Mrs. George Bedell.
You went to Iceland, you told me before the interview.
To Iceland, to France, to Spain, Portugal, 2 Scandinavian trips with the Bedells. Then more recently,
you retired so you could get all these travels.
Then more recently, we've discovered the public library English tour with the Bedells. But we sometimes go off independently, and especially we've been discovering these elder hostels. And sometimes they go in the elder hostel independently, sometimes we go independently, and once in a while we'll go to an elder hostel at the same time.
Well, you, because you've lived here so long and you've been involved in so many things, your career has kind of crossed over a lot of people who have lived in Iowa City a long time, like Charlie Ebel.
Oh, sure.
Tell me just briefly about your association with Charlie Ebel.
Well, I think Charlie Ebel may have been the one who typed Dr. Clapp's letter to me that brought me to Iowa City in 1936. If not, if he wasn't the secretary at that moment, he was soon to become the secretary of the school, or the music department. It was the music department in those days. One of the interesting things about Charlie Ebel, well, he had established connection with publishers, publishing houses, and music dealers on the continent. And it was possible in those days for schools to import music duty-free. Mm. Now, that helped a lot because these were Depression days and budgets were really lean. But anyway, Charlie, as secretary of the music department, was able to get music over the foundation library for the university symphonies. And it didn't cost so very much. And maybe it was a little bit questionable, but once in a while he would put in a little, for instance, a little bass music I'd request. I get this bass music for pennies, you know, and boy, it sure helped. That
sure helped. And for people who are new to Iowa City, Ebel Music was his store for many, many years.
That's right. Although he didn't really get it, it didn't become his store until he'd done other things. Then he came back, and of course his publishing connections. And his store is known nationally. It isn't just an Iowa City phenomenon.
And then I know you crossed over with Chris Schrock. He's a physician, but he also played, was his instrument a sax?
No, bassoon. He was a bassoonist. He was an excellent bassoonist. When I first came, I believe he was still first bassoonist of the University Symphony. He was a year or so older than I. And he had a slightly younger sister who was my first accompanist, accompanied me on my first recital. Margaret did.
I love it. And then Clapp was your mentor, and then I know you've mentored a lot of students, but one of your pupils, who's now a professor in philosophy, is Laird Addis.
Oh, yes.
And he was one of your pupils?
Absolutely. He got his undergraduate degree, his bachelor's degree in music with a double major between music and string bass was his main instrument, though he also played clarinet well. But bass was one where he gave a senior recital, high-quality senior recital, and as double majored and got his other half, his degree major, was philosophy. And he also, by the way, composed, and he was quite a good composer. Yeah.
Just like taking after his teacher.
Well, I didn't teach him composition. He studied with other people, but he's a good composer.
I know I see you ride your bike. In rain or shine, you're like the mailman, Professor Obrecht. You ride your bike up that hill on River Street and down. Not right now, but will you tend to ride again this spring?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And what do you do to relax when you're not playing and performing and composing?
Well, a friendly game of bridge.
Bridge?
Yes, a friendly game, you know.
A friendly game.
Yes.
And do you still like to go to movies since you started out and your parents were running the...
Yes, I guess I run towards maybe some of the kinds of things that didn't pull in the biggest crowds, that wouldn't pull the biggest crowds in Rolfe in the days when Rolfe had a theater. But those were days, good days. In those days we had the RKO radio pictures with Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. We had the original Universal Frankenstein, terrified the life out of me, and Dracula. And Columbia movies and all these kinds of things. But then once in a while we got a really good, rather, you know, some of the early Hepburn things that I liked a lot.
Well, I'm going to have to visit Rolfe, Iowa, now that you've brought up so many good things about it.
The wrecking balls destroyed the Ritz Theater, though. It is no more.
Well, I hope you have a wonderful time when you go abroad, and I'm anxious to see you back on your bike, and it's been a real pleasure to have you on One of a Kind. Thank you.
Thank you.
My guest on One of a Kind has been retired University of Iowa professor, musician, and composer Eldon Obrecht. For much of his adult life, he's studied, lived, worked, and performed in Iowa City. His mentor was Philip Greeley Clapp, and Eldon, in turn, was a mentor to many young musicians. His instrument is the double bass. He's performed for orchestras as varied as the National Symphony to the Quad City Symphony. In fact, his association in Davenport began back in the late 30s. He's been very generous to the Iowa City String Orchestra and the Chamber Singers of Iowa City, and they're most grateful for his efforts and time. 3 symphonies that Eldon composed were performed by the U of I Symphony Orchestra. He taught music theory, composition, and a history and music appreciation course. In fact, for many years, this popular and well-loved course was broadcast on WSUI. He and his musician wife, Maxine, raised 4 daughters in Iowa City. They, too, are musicians. Eldon Obrecht is one of a kind.